Now you can cut yourself.
I'm just going upstairs.
Okay. Now, Kevin, Arthur is listening. Teach us.
Okay, so first name for all the cholim. And
before you get started, I actually do want to dedicate this year to a friend of mine that passed away. He used to be part of the Gemara shir at Maharsha with Schottenstein. I think I met him when he was 82. He passed away at 96. So his name is Dr. Oscar Koren.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, a very, very generous human being, smart and intelligent and sensitive and just a good soul. So they're having tonight, obviously, his spade and for him, etc. He was obviously very dear to a lot of people, not only at Maharsha, but at the Kollel. To learn there, Rabbi Goldschmidt spoke about him. And obviously, Rav Simcha Steinhauer was at the funeral. But just obviously a dedication to this in his memory.
Amen.
Okay.
I think he was also involved in Shiva Gedola many years ago.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So, and I think this is actually quite appropriate, what I'm going to read, which I'm sure it applies to him as it applies to you guys and many other people that we know. Attributes that complement the attribute of kindness. So it says, it's continuing with the discussion with an Eliezer recruited, so to speak, Rivka for marriage partner, as a marriage partner for Yitzhak. And it's, for Yaakov. And it says, there's swiftness and patience. So swiftness is to do things quickly. And so Rivka, she took initiative and she didn't wait till they started dying of thirst, the camels. She gave them to drink as soon as she could. Now that was swiftness. And then patience is another attribute. It only mentions these two, which is actually quite interesting. After Eliezer drank from the water, Rivka tells him, now I will draw water even for your camels until they have finished drinking. She pledges to wait until all of the camels have finished drinking. And I think, I'm just going to add something here. We have to be patient. Sometimes people annoy us and they drive us mad. And we just have to be patient and not jump to conclusions and judge. And because sometimes if you're patient, if you don't answer immediately or react, sometimes the feeling of bother or annoyance goes away. It's not easy. It's sometimes we need to just try hold back whenever we can. And yeah, I think I just thought of that.
Okay. Guys, with regards to yesterday's shir, I just want to give you a summation. Now, Rava, you've got this discussion with Rava and Abaya. So this is Rava's opinion. Rava maintains that according to Rabbi Shimon, do you remember there was if you're whitening by removing the dirt particles, in other words, compared to the filthy state it was in, it's deemed as whitening. But that is done by hand in a gentle manner. That doesn't constitute a physical change. But obviously, then it because there's not a physical change, it isn't acquired by the thief. Okay, nor is it acquired by the person, the farmer that's meant to give the first shearings to the Kohen. Now, you can compare that by whitening, by combing. And the reason that constitutes a change, even though it's not bleaching, is because when you're combing the fabric, it's going to inherently change the fibers, and it is going to have an impact on the physical properties of the fibers itself, as opposed to gently cleaning off dirt. Okay, so that's Rava's two opinions of when cleaning the dirt by inverted commas whitening it as opposed to bleaching it constitutes a change when you're actually roughly using a combing to clean the fibers as opposed to removing it gently with your hands. When there's a physical change that is involved, then obviously it's acquired by the party that makes such a change. In this case, the farmer who doesn't then give the first shearings to the Koren, because he has to give a man and a half out of 5 ewes, which is 7.5 manna. And if he does this to one of the 5 ewes worth of wool, it doesn't combine for the prerequisite amount. Now, Rava also says that dyeing with a dye that can be removed with detergent doesn't constitute a physical change. Why? Because there's no permanence. But if you dye with indigo, which is color fast and can't be removed with detergent, that does constitute a permanent physical change. According to the rabbis, however, they've got a different opinion to Rava. Whitening, although irreversible, especially if we're not even talking about cleaning, but we're even taking it a step further, and we're saying that maybe there is sulfuric acid that's burned with it, and it's almost like a bleaching effect. They're saying that even that, although it's irreversible, is too insignificant to change. So even if you go to that extreme and you're not just cleaning it, it never affects acquisition, which is why they rule in the second brisa that if you merely whiten the shearings of the ewe before accumulating the requisite amount, they combine and therefore goes to the Kohen. Now, Rabbi Shimon, as far as the brisa is concerned, that holds that the whitening does constitute a change, is seeing that that sort of process of bleaching does in fact mean that it's significant enough, whereas the rabbis say it's not. Okay, but dyeing is different because it's so significant that a change always affects acquisition, even when the dye can be removed with detergent. So that's why they rule in the third brisa, which Rav interprets as referring to removable dye, that dyeing prevents combination of the the 5 ewes worth of wool. So in other words, Rava is saying that dyeing, if it's reversible, doesn't constitute a change, but the rabbis are saying that even if it's reversible, it does constitute a change. So, guys, I hope I've put it in perspective in terms of summary. Now,
Yeah.
Abaya has got something to say, and he says, look, we're under the impression that there's a general rabbinic opinion that physical change constitutes an act of acquisition by the party that's made the change. So again, if a thief has physically changed the properties to where it's irreversible, and in that particular case, he acquires the item and he just gives a cash equivalent stock. But we're saying, Abaya is saying it's not always the opinion generally of the rabbis. It's of many of the Tanoim, but there are a list of Tanoim that hold that change doesn't affect acquisition. So he lists the following. He says, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Beis Shammai, Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and Rav Yishmael all hold that an article that undergoes a change remains in its place. In other words, even though the article has undergone a physical change, it doesn't leave the original owner's possession. So, just wanted to explain to you Rashi's explanation on a couple of these issues. There's two different expressions. There's an expression saying Amru Dabar Echad, which means they say all one and the same. And that's in contrast to what we have by here. Because if the rabbis that we just mentioned say one and the same thing, the Tanaim, that denotes that various opinions are in complete agreement with one another. But it doesn't use the expression there. It uses the expression kolhu severa lahu, which means they all hold. What does it mean they all hold? It means there are various opinions that are not in complete agreement with each other, but they hold the basic concept to varying degrees, okay? So in other words, they all adhere to the same basic line of reasoning, the shitta, which is your methodology of thought. But as far as the halacha is concerned, it can't actually accord with the shitta. Why? Because if the various Tanaim don't agree on every point, you're not going to get a majority halachic opinion. Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, if they agree to some level, you say, okay, in a certain circumstance, maybe we can find where they've all got agreement. But if they hold by a similar line of thinking, my blood sugar, a similar line of thinking, but in that similar line of thinking, they're going to use examples where they don't agree with each other. How are you going to call halacha with that? So therefore, because they're all holding with a similar premise, shitta, but the application of it is different and exceptions are different, we can't use them as halacha. Whereas the Tanaic view that physical change does acquire permanent acquisition by the person that made the change, they all are of one and the same opinion. So we have to go by that consistency. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start to analyze where each of these Tanaim expressed such a view, and we're going to say, okay, so this is where they say that physical change does not affect the ownership, and it stays with the original owner. Okay, so we've already learned this with Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda. Why? Because if you look at what we did yesterday in the Brisa, if the only change that was made was that the owner dyed the wool of each successive ewe before sharing the next one, what happens is the fleeces of all the ewes combine to complete the requisite amount. So we don't say that each successive fleece was physically changed and is no longer extant. Okay, so that wasn't the general opinion. Because what happens here is we had this case of Rav Shimon ben Yehuda quoting Rabbi Shimon. So his view of Rabbi Shimon was very simple. He said, look, dying isn't enough of a change to stop them from combining, even if you've done it on one of the 5 ewes. Okay? But that's his explanation. Now you've got the opinion of the rabbis on Rabbi Shimon that says dying is significant enough where it doesn't, where it's not the same and it doesn't combine. But there we're talking about permanent dyeing, so to speak, as opposed to a temporary removable dye with detergent. So we're saying that we can already see that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, explaining Rabbi Shimon, doesn't hold that even Rabbi Shimon says that dyeing has any permanent factor of it. So we know that that's the case. Now, there's an issue because Tosfot finds a bit of a difficulty with the buyer's contention that this demonstrates that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda's view is that a change does not affect any sort of acquisition. Why? Because if one spun the wool or wove the wool of each successively sheared ewe, in other words, we're not even talking about dyeing. If he affected the fabric in some way, they don't combine because all of a sudden it's changed enough that one portion of the fifth, the 1.5 manna, can't be combined to achieve the complete requisite amount. So in that case, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda obviously maintains that a change affects acquisition. So how can we say here that he doesn't? Because, okay, in the case of dyeing, he said it doesn't when he's quoting Rabbi Shimon. But as far as altering the physical properties of the wool, if you spin it or weave it, it does affect acquisition. So how can it hold that he doesn't see that a physical change affects acquisition when he's got 2 different opinions? So Tosfot brings a good answer, and he says, look, a buyer doesn't mean to say that all the Tanaim hold that a change doesn't affect acquisition altogether, but rather they all maintain to some degree that a change doesn't affect acquisition. So Abai maintains that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda holds that a change such as dyeing doesn't alter the physical composition of the stolen article to effect acquisition. In other words, it's changing the look of it, but it doesn't change the fibers to that extent, like spinning it or weaving it. So we're saying here that although they hold that the physical change doesn't affect acquisition, it's only in certain circumstances. That's why they say they're not of one and the same opinion, and that shitta is not halacha. Okay? So now we see where the nuances are. Now, there's another issue, because now the next case, apart from Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, is Beis Shammai. Now, we learned this. So what's a proof, if you remember, that we learned that Rav Shimon, Beis Shammai doesn't hold that a change affects acquisition? Well, I'm going to bring back your memory to what we learned in Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 19. And what does it say? You shall not bring a harlot's payment or a dog's exchange to the house of Hashem, your God, for any vow offering. For also both of them are an abomination of Hashem, your God. So basically, you can't bring a dog as a sacrifice and say, listen, nails of vow, or anything like that. You can't even bring it on the altar. It's insulting to Hashem. So that's the first issue. But now what we're focusing on, and we actually focused on many dafs ago, in the 65th daf, in fact, which is about 20 dafs before this, is we said, listen, this woman could have been paid in a bartering system. What do we mean? Is that if it was flour, she could have basically, let me put it like this. If she was given wheat kernels as her harlot's payment for services rendered, she could have made it into fine flour. Maybe the guy had a vineyard and gave her olives, and she could have made them into olive oil. Or if he gave her grapes and she made it into wine, then what we are saying is that's a physical change where the properties have changed completely, but it's still prohibited for an offering. So what does that mean according to Beis Shammai? Is although these items have undergone a significant physical change, they still considered, at least from a monetary perspective, to be the original payment received by the harlot for prostitution. So because she committed an avera, they remain forbidden as offerings, because that was in lieu of her payment, even though she changed the physical property. So it's similarly, when a robber steals an article and then it undergoes a physical change, according to some opinions, it's still considered the same article that was stolen, and therefore it must be returned intact by the robber. Because there's some Tanaic opinions that say that physical change takes place, and others that say no, it doesn't, if you're holding by Beis Shammai. Okay. Now, it was taught in another brisa, it's now permitted for offering. So we're saying, hang on a second. The significant change was from a physical perspective, rendered then from a monetary perspective, that they're considered to be different items from the original payment received by the harlot, because they're not even recognizable. So they're permitted as offerings, okay? So those are the same halachic opinions that say that when a thief steals an item and physically changes wood and planes it and makes a chair, it's no longer considered the same article as was stolen. So the robber is required to give monetary equivalent, but not return the item itself. So you can see there's a parallel between if we're holding by Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai in terms of robbery and harlot's payment. So how do we resolve this contradiction? Well, we did it in the 65th daf. Rav Yosef said in resolution of the contradiction between the two brisot, the following brisa was taught by Gurion of Asperg. Beis Shammai prohibits the flour, oil, and wine offerings, okay? Because a physical change doesn't render the item permissible, because you earned it through a prohibited act, an avera, and therefore it might have changed the look, but that's still in lieu of your payment. However, Beis Hillel permits the offerings because he's saying that when it changes its physical properties, it doesn't resemble physically what got paid for, and therefore it's not considered to be the same article that you got paid for. So therefore a change acquires acquisition, whereas Beis Shammai says a change remains in its place. Okay? Now, what's the reason of Beis Shammai for prohibiting them as an offering after that after there's some sort of physical change? Because if we have a look at the pasuk, and you look at respect to the prohibition against bringing a harlot payment or a dog's exchange for an offering, it uses the term also the both of them. Okay? So it says, you shall not bring a harlot's payment or a dog's exchange to the house of Hashem your God, or any vow offering, for also both of them are an abomination to Hashem your God. So you don't have to say that word also both of them. It's actually superfluous. So if you read that in Devarim chapter 23, verse 19, what it's saying is both of them are an abomination. What do you mean? So you could say, you don't need to say that. You could say a harlot's payment or a dog. Saying both of them, you don't have to say also both of them. It says the minute you say and, it implies both of them. So what it's coming to teach you is it also includes, according to Beis Shammai, the changed forms. In other words, if you have a harlot's payment and she changed it from wheat kernels into flour or olives into oil, whatever form it was in which you got paid and whatever form it becomes physically, that was still monetary payment, however you changed it over, for an act that was prohibited by the Torah. Now, Beis Shammai doesn't read the verse like that. He learns it with the word them. So if you focus on the word, not also both of them, but just the word them, what it's actually implying is that them, the actual condition at which you got paid, that's excluded. In other words, the original format, but not the changed forms. That's allowed. So then the Gemara says, well, okay, well then how would Beis Shammai interpret the word them? So Beis Shammai uses the term them to say, listen, only they are prohibited, but not their offspring. So what we are saying is here, look, the harlot sleeps with a local butcher and he gives her enough steak for a month. He gives her a cow, but he decides not to shecht the cow and gives her a live cow. Now, at that particular stage, and in fact, let's just say he gives her a slaughtered cow, but that cow is pregnant with a fetus. That cow is, even if it's in the raw carcass, she can't bring it, but even if she turns it into mincemeat where it doesn't resemble what it is, that's prohibited, but not the changed form. In other words, the fetus that comes from that pregnant animal, she can give on the mizbeach, because it's not the actual animal itself that she was paid with. Do you get what I'm saying? So their offspring is not considered prohibited at all. So Beis Shammai is saying it's only that article, whether it changed forms or not, that remains in its original state. So we don't acknowledge a physical change means a change of acquisition. Otherwise, you could bring it on the altar. But what comes from those changed forms are different. In other words, say you get paid in grapes, and then you grow a vine tree from that. That vine tree no longer resembles it because it's too much of a disconnect and a step away from it. So Beis Hillel, Beis Hillel, what is he going to reply to the fact that it uses the term them? Because here, Beis Shammai is saying, listen, the actual changed forms and themselves are not allowed, but the offspring is. So how would Beis Hillel interpret that one? So Beis Hillel would say to you, look, you learn two things from the exclusionary expression then. You learn that it applies only to them, meaning the wheat kernels or the olives or the grapes, but not to their byproduct, which means the flour or the olive oil or the wine. So them and not their changed forms, and it applies to them but not their offspring. So he says in that case he agrees with Beis Shammai that the offspring are even a further step removed than just changing the physical properties of that item. So then the Gemara says, okay, that's fine, but there's a term also that's written, and that's how Beis Shammai turns around and says both them and their changed forms are prohibited, meaning we don't acknowledge that any physical property change has meant a change of ownership where it can be offered on the altar. So what is Beis Hillel going to do with that word also? And the answer is it's a difficult according to Beis Hillel. It doesn't mean that Beis Hillel, by the way, has lost the argument, the Gemara says. It just says that we can't answer that refutation to Beis Hillel because we don't have brises anymore that would have given an explanation. But for sure, if somebody of Beis Hillel's level, he would know for sure what to do with that word. So he didn't lose the argument against Beis Shammai. We just don't have a source of how he explained that particular fact. That term also didn't include the changed forms. Do you get what I'm saying? And generally, the halacha accords with Beis Hillel, just so you know. So we look at learning the next tonight ruling. So remember, Bias said Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov is also one of the Tanaim that don't believe that a physical change affects acquisition. Because it was taught in a brisa, Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov says, one stole a seah of wheat, ground it into flour. He kneaded it and baked it and separated challah from it. How can he recite the blessing? This person is not blessing Hashem, but blaspheming him. And concerning such a person, it's stated, a thief who recites a blessing has blasphemed Hashem. So what it's saying is here is that this is a very similar case to Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Why? Is because, let's just give you the context. If you look at Numbers, which is Bamidbar, chapter 15, verse 17 to 21, the Torah requires that a portion of kneaded dough be separated and given to the Kohen. People still do this today. And that portion is actually called the challah. Now, challah should be separated from the main dough at which you can bake. And what happens is Rav Elazar ben Yaakov said, listen, dough is not in the raw form. It's gone through a couple of processes now. You've gone through the grinding, the kneading, the kneading, the baking, okay? And because it's changed in so many ways, you could still think that this is not the original stolen property and it's treated like a different item. Why? Because it's not even recognizable. Flour, once it's ground and sifted and kneaded and now it becomes dough, is different to flour. The minute liquid's added. When you bake that, it's different to dough. So many changes have taken place that if physical change did mean that there was a change of acquisition, would no longer be held responsible that he couldn't do a brocha if he didn't separate that portion of challah for the Kohen. Okay? So there's two opinions here. The one says it's because the person's a thief. They never separated the of Kohen, which he should have done. And the other one's saying it's not that he's a thief, but you can't enjoy something which was meant for somebody else, even if you were absent of mind, and do a blessing over it. That's a blessing over a transgression. Whichever opinion you hold, this is proving that no matter how many times you change it, you're still not allowed to do a blessing over it. Which means what? A physical change does not affect acquisition. That's the proof that Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov says it. Because if you change the physical property, you should be able to then acquire it and say, well, just like the sheep shearing of the first 5 ewes, you don't have to give it back to a Kohen. Do you get what I'm saying? So that's saying that this doesn't hold that physical change affects acquisition. So there's another tonight ruling, and we say, okay, so we get that. Now, what's this case of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that a change doesn't affect acquisition? Because he's got a different rule. He said, look, if you're having a look at this with respect to a robber, right? In other words, somebody stole a cup and then the robber affected it. What do we mean affected it? He basically decided to fatten the stolen animal by feeding it quite a lot. Now, what's going to happen is that he has the upper hand, because he's entitled to take appreciation for that which he returns to the original owner. Because he can say to the original owner, listen, this is the animal that was before you. It was a skinny little animal, and now I've made it fat. I want the balance of my money for feeding. So it was worth 100 zuz, skinny little cow. Now he's made it worth 150 zuz. He can return it back to the original owner, get a food to sugar for the 100 zuz it was worth, and even demand from the original owner the 50 zuz that it cost him to feed the animal and fatten it up. Okay? Which means that a change does not affect acquisition, because it means then the animal would be his and he'd only have to give 100 zuz and keep the 150 zuz a new animal. Because according to Rav Sheshes, explaining Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he takes the appreciation. But on the other way around, if the animal deteriorated, he can say to the owner, listen, I'm returning the animal. Okay, it's a bit skinny now. Was it worth 150 zuz? It's now a bit malnourished. I can't look after it. You keep it. Because the animal's still alive. It's not dead, and you're going to have to accept it. And I can still get my teshuvah. So that is acceptable, because the change of the weight loss doesn't then acquire the animal by the robber. So the Gemara is saying, listen, it doesn't make sense. If a thief gets paid for the appreciation, why doesn't he have to pay the original owner for the depreciation? And the Gemara said, listen, there's a couple of things to bear in mind here. We want to make sure that the person can do it teshuvah. Now, if he's not going to get compensation and he staked 50 zuz worth of food into this cow to make it fat, he's not going to want to return it to the original owner because he's losing money. All we're saying is the original owner, he pays him for the feed that he did in order to make this cow fatter, which is a fair deal. And then the person can have the original animal back. As far as the depreciation is concerned, we also allow it in order to have teshuvah, because otherwise, if he has to give a monetary payment and the animal depreciated, he might basically not want to do it, because he might not have the money. This way, he can give the animal back and say, look, I'm not capable of looking after this animal. Get a proper teshuvah. But we're only talking about here a case where firstly there's a reversible change. In other words, if the animal's malnourished past the point of survival, that doesn't count, because that's a permanent physical change. If the animal's a little bit emaciated and malnourished, the original owner can feed it up to get it back to its previous state. So that's a reversible change of malnutrition. So therefore, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a permanent physical change. That's number one. Also, we say that there is an issue. If the animal grew fatter on its own, there's a question as to whether or not the thief can be reimbursed. There's an opinion that says no, because the animal's appreciation was through normal growth and development. The robber isn't paid the compensatory amount. However, if it can be proved it was because he fed the animal past a certain point, then in that case we do, because he's going to say, well, look, I sunk 30 zuz in this animal. It might have appreciated anyway, but if I didn't feed it, it would have starved. Now I'm losing 30 zuz. So in most cases, we say we give it back to him. Now, if there's a surplus in prices, in that case, we don't give it back to him, because he never created his own expense to create the animal's appreciation. He's not allowed to get that appreciation. That is purely market related, and he doesn't deserve to be rewarded because he wasn't out of pocket. Okay? So what does that prove? It proves that even though that the animals had a physical change, either appreciated or depreciated weight, that physical change doesn't render the animal changed where the thief can now keep it and give the monetary equivalent. So that's a proof, according to that's a proof, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that a physical change doesn't affect acquisition for the thief. All right, guys. I think we've done enough. I hope it's been clear.
I just want to ask you something. We said in the last one or two sessions that that you can't. What's it called? You can't. That that the thief has to repay whatever the value was at the time of theft. So why is appreciation's not the true value at the time
Excellent
of theft?
question. Excellent. Gavin, you're so awake, it's scary. It's beautiful. So the reason is as follows, is because generally you're absolutely correct. You have to only return in the state it was found, which is why you can give a depreciated animal, because, well, you can't really, because that's not the state that it was found. But if the person has, let's talk about the case of appreciation. If the guy stuck in 10,000 Rand into feeding the animal, but he's not going to want to return the animal, he'll never get his money back. He'd rather just pay the cash at the time and then keep the animal. That's not a proper teshuva. So do you get what I'm saying? So we're saying, listen, he's entitled to be paid back for the fact that he fed the animal, but not if there's a market-related price that caused the animal's pricing structure to be jacked up. In terms of depreciation, that wasn't at the time of robbery. He should actually pay in, but we know he's not going to do that. So as long as the animal can be fattened up by the original owner, there's no permanent physical change. So it counts in terms of teshuva. Exactly.